Welcome to RevOps Co-op video interviews. I'm your interviewer, Camela Thompson, and today I'm joined by Max Elster. Max, tell us a little bit about yourself and why we're talking about the topic we have selected.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Max, born and raised in Cologne, currently living in San Francisco. I'm actually based in Berlin right now, which has brutal heat, but it's good to be back in the home country. I'm one of the founders and CEO of a company called Minoa. We essentially help companies instill a value-based selling motion. So companies that are thinking about implementing some sort of initiative around ROI, really thinking about how to bring in value-based selling to all their reps. We are usually one of the solutions that they consider in order to really help people build better business cases and instill the ROI motion. I previously was in several fast growing tech companies, and one of my responsibilities was how to think about value and value props and how to actually enable sales teams in selling on value instead of features coming from a product angle. So I was very much excited about the topic before starting Minoa, and then we basically made a company out of it and built a product around helping go-to-market teams.
So as somebody who has been in product marketing and led marketing in addition to being in revenue operations, I know exactly why sellers are trying to move to value with budgets disappearing and people canceling things that really aren't showing tangible ROI. But I'd like to do a quick thought exercise for the people listening as revenue operators. You all are technical buyers, and I want you to just step into those shoes for a second and think about going to a website and seeing we can give you 3x ROI. Now, Max, I want to discuss with you why immediate skepticism should come to everybody's mind, because that's usually where the buyers come from. Why does that happen so often?
I mean, it's a good point, right? I think it is very frustrating when you see these numbers that are kind of being thrown around. And I think it comes back to a couple of dimensions. One, that the topic of ROI is often seen in isolation. And I think it's like looking at it in isolation is not going to actually bring any fruitful results. I think when just academically looking at the term ROI is essentially looking at what's the benefit for the customer, and you divide that essentially by the investment, right? Of like how much does the software or the vendor charge for the respective product. And I think that's just a very limited viewpoint on understanding what's the benefit for a customer. And an ROI is usually just the end result of great discovery, of understanding the customer's pain points, and then actually putting a price tag behind it and linking it back to the benefit. And I think you can't just put that on a website. That's not how it works, right? There's actually a process in order to understand a customer, and that process has an end result being an ROI number that is part of a conversation with the customer and the seller. So I think that's kind of one of the first parts. It's just a very frustrating experience, which is kind of the underlying issue is essentially how they look at ROI in isolation. I think the other part that I think is often forgotten, ROI only makes sense when you collaborate with the respective champion on the customer side. And when you work with them in order to understand their business, in order to understand their customer inputs as well, like what are the inputs that you need to get from a champion in order to build a sophisticated business case that includes an ROI at the end of the day. But that's oftentimes missing just putting it on a website, right? You actually don't talk to a customer, you don't get their inputs, you don't actually know what their business challenges are. And so the ROI at the end is just a misconception of basically an understanding of what's going on in the business, essentially.
Yeah, and I think there's a myth out there that marketers make those numbers up. And unfortunately, as a marketer, I can tell you that we're often under pressure to make those numbers up. So when I'm thinking of revenue operators who are defending their own revenue operations budget and they want to keep a tool, they're actually pretty well adept at translating the benefits they have into ROI, or I hope they are. But let's talk about why RevOps is in such a good position to help champion for the customers and establish a process.
Mm. I think RevOps is in a very unique position because A, they have the oversight of what is actually going on in the business and what are the priorities that need to be considered in order to evaluate new vendors. But also, if you are a company selling a product, RevOps has a great perspective on what are actually the gaps and the bottlenecks within the entire sales funnel, and how can you basically understand what's missing out today in order to ensure that win rates go up, average deal sizes go up, and that's kind of where RevOps very uniquely has an interesting position within a company to understand the entire process and the bottlenecks. And I think that's something when you look at it from like a 30,000 feet view, RevOps is kind of the orchestrator of the entire process, and understanding how ROI can be embedded into the sales process has to come through an initiative that also RevOps is not just included in, but also has a clear kind of guideline of how ROI should be embedded in an ideal sales process. And I think that's where on either from like looking at it from a customer perspective or from a company selling, that's like where RevOps can be basically like this synergetic like viewpoint on like where do you bring in ROI, how do you enable like your sellers to build a business case, but also when you review software and the different vendors, like where do you pick and choose how a business case should be communicated internally. I think that's a unique opportunity for the RevOps team to kind of be thinking about that continuously.
And it can be a little bit daunting initially because you may have theories about what could be positively impacted, and those things may not be. So, people in revenue operations, I really encourage them to start thinking about the KPIs that could be impacted,
Mm-hmm.
and see, ideally, like we look at HubSpot and they have such tremendous ROI data because they have access to everything, the deal
That's right.
data, all of that. Easy, right? But
Mm-hmm.
most of us are dealing with products that are loosely integrated. We don't have direct access into a lot of these things, or we have data agreements that prevent us from doing that. So in those cases, how do you encourage RevOps to really think about um, creating that ROI proposition? Like, how should they think about that and establish a process with the customer?
Yeah, you bring up HubSpot, which is interesting. I think during the RevOps Co-op conference in San Diego, Daphne, who's basically looking into, funny enough, like value from a customer success point, which we can come to later, like how they actually play a role in customer success and how they're involved. But she talked about HubSpot being a multi-billion-dollar company, only has 6 value drivers that actually they can focus on, which sometimes, like I talk to companies that are much smaller than HubSpot, and they think about hundreds of use cases that they could be selling, right? And at the end of the day, RevOps can actually have a strong perspective and opinion on actually saying, let's reduce this and make it simpler, not just for the seller, but also make it simpler for the customer, right? Because if the customer sees 100 different potential pathways of using a product, forget about it, right? Nobody is going to understand it. They're not going to understand how it impacts their company and their business outcomes that they want to target. So I think when it comes to RevOps and their involvement there, I think really sitting together with, if there's product marketing, you mentioned that you've been in product marketing before, product marketing, customer success, sales leadership, and oftentimes there's just some sort of, if there's some sort of value engineering or at least a person that considers value to be an important aspect of a company, then like sit together and think about if we would need to nail down our value prop to like a few key value drivers and use cases that we can offer, what would that look like? And make it a thought experiment, make it fun, and think about what's going to come out of it, and maybe ask your customers as well, right? Like what do they see as a core value? And you're probably going to find a lot of patterns. And I think RevOps can kind of build this strategic initiative around it, because at the end of the day, if you are a 100 million AR company or a 50 million AR company and you have 45 different value drivers and hundreds of use cases, and HubSpot has 6, there's probably something wrong there. And it's like a great opportunity to make it simpler and easier, not just for the seller, but also for the customer.
That's a fantastic point. And I encourage everybody in revenue operations to think about the two things that the CFO and CEO ultimately care about, and that's profitability and growth. So I think a lot of products impact that in a lot of different ways. Every company has a ton of key performance indicators that they're watching, but ultimately, we need to figure out how to get as close to those two factors as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Do
Well said.
you?
Well said. Well said.
Okay.
I think
I was going to say, do you want to debate?
profitability, yeah, profitability, growth, and like we often say, there's basically like 3 frameworks on how to think about it, right? Either you can be helping in terms of like helping your customers generate more revenue, which of course is all about growth. Either you can help them reduce costs, which is kind of another pathway of essentially saying profitability
Yep.
and increasing your margins. Or you can look at basically some sort of risk component, which of course a lot of
Mm.
security companies say tap into the notion of, okay, what happens if XYZ occurs in maybe a month or two or in a year or two, there's going to be substantial insurance risk that's going to be approaching you if you don't have the right security placement, the security measures in place, right? So there's the risk component, which at the end of the day could probably be related back to either revenue or costs. And I think that's at the end of the day directly related to the actual P&L of a company.
I think that's a great point. Risk is so motivating. So, how we can't all be HubSpot. And yes, I may have been editing that video on the main stage before we did this. So it was top
Oh,
of
you did
mind.
again, right? Yeah.
But we can't all be HubSpot. We can't have access to all the KPIs. How should RevOps be involved in determining the infrastructure necessary to do this?
hmm I think, first of all, I think it should be an initiative that covers the entire life cycle of the company, right? So preferably not just pre-sales, but also post-sales. So I guess RevOps being the closest strategic partner to a chief revenue officer, for example, I think if they can sit at the same table and think about what do we actually want to achieve? We want to increase our revenue by X%. How does that relate back to enabling our team to be thinking in much simpler terms about what our value prop can be and how can we essentially also looking at ramp times. People are getting back into the motion of hiring more salespeople again, and there's at least a forward-looking like positive outlook. And like now it's the question of how do you enable these people to get ramped up quicker than before with a more simpler value prop and really generating revenue quicker. And I think that's where RevOps can build the strategic perspective on defining the clear initiatives and outcomes together with the chief revenue officer. And then I think it's about more aligning the respective teams and also clearly defining who's responsible for what. Because oftentimes I talk to companies and I ask them, who's responsible for your value prop? Who's responsible for basically defining the benefit of your solution? And oftentimes people look at each other and I don't know, and you hear like different opinions, and some people even don't have somebody responsible. So I think RevOps needs to be in charge in clearly sitting down with the right team members and defining who's going to be responsible in continuously iterating and refining the value prop. And then I think it's more about linking it back to the process. So one of the trends that we are seeing where RevOps has a huge influence is that there might be a dedicated stage in the funnel that actually says, or in the sales funnel that actually says value stage or business case created, something that is more tied to the topic of ROI and value. And then RevOps can actually, of course, build the notion and the requirements together with the team around what's actually needed to drive a deal forward and how does an ROI related business case play a role in that.
So I think I hear a lot of people say, ideally, you want to track this in product and have this developed. But I also see a lot of people make the assumption that usage metrics are a valuable estimate for ROI. And I'm just like, no, think about like, when's the last time your CFO says you need to cut software and you say, but I use it. They don't care. Like, what do you use it for? And what benefit do you get out of it?
Right.
So how do you encourage people to think about what is valuable for the customer versus not?
Mm-hmm. It's oftentimes not usage, right? That's I think the simple term. Why? I think there's an aspect of yes, you can bring it into the product, or you can just kind of bring in product metrics. And having been in product before, I, of course, have a big passion for product metrics and things that product cares about. But at the end of the day, when you talk to a C-level executive and an economic buyer, they might have never actually looked at your product before, right? So they don't even know what adoption means respective to that particular product. They just look at essentially like they have like a portfolio of different assets and they compare what's the highest return, how do we make future buying decisions, how do we make budgeting decisions for the next year. And then if you don't relate your usage metric to something that they care about, you might be on the list to get crossed out, right? And I think that's something that needs to be clear to every software vendor these days, or not even software in general, that's just much harder and people are scrutinizing much more. What does it mean particularly for the question? I think what I would kind of think about is the product has some sort of outcome effect, right? I mean, HubSpot, yes, it's great if people add more opportunities and if people basically walk customers through the pipeline, but that's probably not what's relevant. What's relevant is that if you use HubSpot, you generate more revenue, right? Or if you use basically a knowledge management solution, you distribute knowledge faster, which means that people have access to knowledge quicker, which means that they can make decisions faster, innovate faster, right? It's like, what's the outcome of of your solution? And I think the best thing you can do is just ask your customers, right? Like, what did you do with the time that you gained back, or what are you actually doing with basically using a particular tool or a particular functionality within the product? And then you can actually learn more about what they care about, which you can then refer back to your, we call it the value framework, right? Or essentially the ROI motion that you try to implement.
Yeah. So just to create an example, if you're a marketing analytics platform, your success metric should not be how many people are logging in and looking at reports. It should be, did their revenue generation for every dollar spent improve? Like that's
So
far more compelling. Now, I really like, you brought this up briefly, but I'd like to dive into it a bit more. Let's talk about building a process and how essential that is.
yeah, it's a we sometimes call it the value loop, which actually like one of our advisors, Doug May, he's essentially built value and revenue teams at different fast-growing companies like Datadog, Databricks, and now he's at Harness. And one of the things that he always talks about, which we found very fascinating and fits very much into what we're seeing on the market, is that value is not a checkbox item anymore. ROI is not a checkbox item. It's essentially a conversation that goes through the entire life cycle of basically working with your customer. It starts from basically the first nurture point with as you're targeting customers, like how do you communicate a more value-centered message to a potential buyer or somebody that could actually be your champion within their stakeholder group? How do you then transfer that into a pre-sales motion where you don't just want, coming back to what we started with, ROI to be something on the website that's isolated. You want actually to bring everything that's on the marketing side, like what's communicated there, into the pre-sales motion and articulating something that actually resonates with the pain points that the buyer goes through, but also then bring in reference points from other customers that might be similar, that had similar ideas on which business outcomes they want to impact in 2024, 2025. And then as soon as you close the customer, try to come back to what you've communicated and what you promised in terms of the outcomes that you are expecting the customer to have with your solution, and bring that back into not just, again, a checkbox item on the customer success side, but a repeatable process where, for example, for every QBR, you could actually bring up, hey, this is what we discussed last year as we closed the deal and we basically kind of started the partnership. This is the business case that we kind of had in place. This is now how this is going to look like as we have the first QBR. This is what the executive should care about. This is the outcome that we've had. We might be at 30% of what we initially discussed, but these are the action items that we actually would love to put in place in order to ensure that we get to 100% as quick as possible for the respective renewal date, for example, right? And then when you talk to these, for example, like RevOps and customer success in basically like a tandem, you often see that also create some sort of like first like defensive motion of like, oh God, what happens if we only achieve 30% of the outcomes that we promised? The problem is at some point in time, the customer is going to realize it and it's going to cross you out, right? So rather bring it up early, but then find measures and initiatives with the customer to drive up the 30 to 100%. And being more transparent earlier is probably always better, especially in these times where there's not just money flying around, right? So I think that's kind of where I think the process matters so much, and not just seeing it as a check mark, but as a process and a conversation throughout the entire funnel makes it a great initiative also for RevOps to think about this, because that's what they breathe by, right? Like true, like impactful initiatives that impact the entire revenue lifecycle.
And this should be a natural fit for revenue operators, because just think of how happy you would be if a vendor came to you and said, hey, if this is working for your company, here are the metrics you should expect to see positive impact to. And to get a benchmark, like a trend line early on, and then watch how that changes over time. So I go back to analytics platforms because that's what I've marketed and used and sold the most. But I think of, if we have a really good go-to-market analytics platform, can we identify sticking points in the funnel and improve them? Can we increase our close rate? There's just so many different things. I think you raise a really good point, though, in setting the expectation, especially as a young company that hasn't figured this out yet, that, hey, we haven't figured this out yet. Here's our theory. Can you help us test this out? And then just being super
Right.
transparent.
Yeah, and everybody talks about trust these days, right? Of like building trust with your respective stakeholders on the customer side. What's the best way of building trust? It's the same like in private life, right? If you can be vulnerable about the most important things, but you can have a game plan in mind about what's relevant, right? And if you can do the same in a business setting environment and just be open about the challenges that you're seeing, maybe a company is also very unique with its challenges compared to 99 of your other customers that you have, right? But let's try to figure out what's the particular pain point. And it all comes back to there's this famous quote from Paul Graham, which was like one of the founders of Y Combinator. And he said, do things that don't scale. And I think sometimes we think about areas in the business, especially as we grow, of like, okay, we need to scale everything, but there will be aspects of just being very open with a customer, especially in these QBR renewal settings where you may be doing things that don't scale, but that are going to be helpful for your customer to renew and then also upsell, cross-sell with additional use cases down the line.
Fantastic. Max, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think it's a great time to be a RevOps executive or somebody in the RevOps space. I think there was oftentimes this notion of what's the role about. I feel like 3, 4, 5 years ago, I feel like every company that I talk to now, they have a great like focus on bringing RevOps into these conversations and really thinking about the entire life cycle. And it's fun to see how the role also gets much more influence and thinking about the ROI and value-based selling initiatives, for example. And I think it's yeah, it's great time to be in RevOps, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. This is such a fantastic way to prove yourself as more of a strategic partner. And I think some of these action items are really achievable. So thank you, Max. Where can people find you online to network?
Sure. Easiest probably is LinkedIn. So Max Elster and Minoa, you're probably going to find me pretty easily. You can also follow our company, of course. Minoa, it's a green logo with a sail on it, and pretty simple to find. Feel free to reach out. Always happy to have a conversation and just brainstorm about what we're seeing in the market and maybe finding solutions for people and kind of what they're going through. And happy to have a conversation at any point in time, or maybe see each other at the next RevOps a co-op meetup or event.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.